Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside. There's a security concern with your boarding. The words cut through the ambient noise of Gate B-17 at John F. Kennedy International Airport, like a knife through silk, sharp and final, leaving Dr. Simone Clark frozen in place with her boarding pass still extended toward the aircraft door. Captain Devin Hayes stood blocking the entrance to the jet bridge, his silver-streaked hair catching the fluorescent terminal lights, his pressed uniform crisp and authoritative, his expression carrying that particular blend of bureaucratic certainty and personal satisfaction that comes from wielding power over someone he'd already decided didn't belong. Simone felt the familiar cold weight settle in her chest. That sensation she'd experienced 1,000 times before in 1,000 different contexts. The moment when the world suddenly reminds you that no matter what you've accomplished or who you've become, some people will only ever see the color of your skin. Her boarding pass clearly displayed Seat 2B in first class, the barcode still glowing green from where the gate agent had just scanned it seconds earlier. But none of that seemed to matter to the captain, whose body language suggested he'd already made up his mind about her before she'd even approached. Behind her, the line of boarding passengers had come to an awkward halt, creating a small crowd of witnesses who suddenly found their phones very interesting, or pretended to be deeply engaged in adjusting their carry-on luggage, that universal human instinct to avoid involvement in someone else's confrontation. A blonde flight attendant appeared in the aircraft doorway behind the captain, her name tag reading Jessica. Her arms crossed over her chest in a posture that broadcast judgment rather than hospitality. Her eyes moving over Simone with the kind of assessment that felt like being priced and found wanting. Simone was dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer over a cream silk blouse, black trousers with a perfect break over her leather loafers, the kind of understated professional elegance that came from knowing you didn't need to announce your success through logos or flash. Her leather bag, Italian-made and expensive without being ostentatious, hung from her shoulder with the worn-in quality that suggested quality rather than newness, and her only jewelry was a simple pair of pearl studs and the slim watch on her wrist that had been a gift from her father when she'd earned her doctorate. "I don't understand," Simone said, keeping her voice level despite the way her heart had begun to pound in her ears, that fight-or-flight response her body insisted on, even when her mind knew better than to show any reaction at all. The gate agent just scanned my boarding pass. Everything was fine. Captain Hayes's expression didn't shift that stone-faced certainty of someone who believed their authority was absolute and unquestionable within their domain. There are irregularities with your ticket that need to be addressed before you can board this aircraft. It's a matter of safety and security. The words safety and security hung in the air like an accusation, and Simone watched as several passengers near her shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking between her and the captain, already making their own calculations about what kind of threat she might pose. She wanted to scream that she'd flown more than 200,000 miles last year alone, that she held elite status on 3 different airlines, that she'd been boarding planes since before some of these passengers were born. But she knew from bitter experience that defending yourself only made you look more guilty in situations like these. "What irregularities?" she asked, her voice still calm, but now carrying an edge of steel that came from years of fighting battles in boardrooms where she was the only woman and often the only person of color. "I have my confirmation email, my booking reference, everything." Jessica, the flight attendant, spoke up for the first time, her voice carrying that particular tone of false concern that barely masked contempt. "The seat you're claiming appears to have been double booked. There's already a passenger in 2B, and the system is showing some discrepancies with your reservation." Simone's mind raced through the possibilities, even as she maintained her composed exterior, the years of navigating corporate politics and academic discrimination having taught her to think 3 steps ahead, even while appearing perfectly calm. Double-booked seats were rare enough in first class to be almost unheard of, especially on a premium evening departure, and the timing of this revelation. Now, after she'd already checked in, cleared security, and received a properly scanned boarding pass, struck her as deeply convenient for someone who'd decided she didn't belong in the premium cabin. "May I see the other passengers' documentation?" Simone asked, her tone still professional, but now carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from someone used to being taken seriously. "If there's truly a duplicate booking, we can resolve this quickly by comparing confirmation numbers and booking dates." Captain Hayes's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, that tiny tell of someone who hadn't expected to be questioned, who'd assumed his word would be enough to make the problem go away. "That's not necessary, ma'am. What's necessary is that you step aside and allow the other passengers to board while we sort this out with the gate agent." Through the aircraft door behind Hayes and Jessica, Simone caught a glimpse of first class, and her eyes landed on seat 2B, where a young man with platinum blonde hair sat sprawled comfortably. His expensive headphones already on his attention focused on his phone screen as he scrolled with the casual disregard of someone who'd never once in his life been questioned about whether he belonged somewhere. He wore a tech startup uniform of designer sneakers, dark jeans, and a hoodie that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and something about his posture suggested he'd grown up assuming the world would accommodate him. "That's Tyler Preston in 2B. Jessica offered, her tone implying this information should mean something, should somehow settle the matter. He checked in at the gate and presented valid documentation. Maria, the gate agent who'd scanned Simone's boarding pass just moments earlier, approached the small cluster with a tablet in hand, her expression troubled and confused in a way that suggested this situation was as much a surprise to her as it was to Simone. "Captain Hayes. I scanned Dr. Clark's boarding pass myself just now, and the system accepted it without any flags or warnings. Her seat assignment has been confirmed since she booked the flight 3 weeks ago." The captain barely glanced at Maria, dismissing her input with the ease of someone who'd decided that his assessment of the situation was the only one that mattered. "The system shows something different now. I don't know what error occurred, but I'm not going to delay this flight arguing about a seat assignment." Simone pulled out her phone with deliberate calm, opening her email app to display the confirmation she'd received when she'd booked the flight, the one that clearly showed her name, her seat assignment, her frequent flyer number, her entire booking history with this airline stretching back years. "Here's my original booking confirmation from 3 weeks ago. The reservation number matches what's on my boarding pass. My seat has been 2B since the moment I purchased this ticket." Hayes glanced at the screen, his eyes barely focusing on the information before he shook his head with that infuriating certainty that comes from someone who believes they can't be wrong because they're in charge. "Electronic records can be manipulated, ma'am. I'm going to need you to work with the gate agent to resolve this issue. This aircraft cannot depart until the situation is cleared up." The statement landed like a slap, the implication clear that Simone was somehow responsible for fabricating or altering her own reservation, that she was the source of the problem, rather than the victim of an obvious injustice. Around her, other passengers were beginning to mutter their annoyance at the delay, starting to manifest in heavy sighs and pointed looks, and she could feel the narrative shifting in real time as Hayes's words painted her as an obstruction, rather than someone being wronged. Tyler Preston, perhaps sensing the drama unfolding at the aircraft door, or perhaps simply annoyed by the delay in departure, pulled off his headphones and looked up from his phone, taking in the scene with the kind of detached amusement of someone watching entertainment that didn't concern him. When his eyes met Simone's for just a moment, she saw something flicker across his face. Not quite guilt, but a shadow of recognition that something wasn't right before he looked away and put his headphones back on, choosing the comfort of ignorance over the discomfort of intervention. Jessica shifted her weight, crossing her arms tighter, and Simone noticed for the first time that the flight attendant wore a small smile, barely visible but definitely present, the expression of someone watching an expected outcome unfold exactly as they'd anticipated. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the main cabin," Jessica suggested with false sweetness. "I'm sure we can find you a seat there." The older woman in line behind Simone whispered something to her husband, and while Simone couldn't make out the words, she caught the tone, that mixture of sympathy and judgment, the sound of someone who felt bad about what was happening, but not bad enough to actually say something. A businessman in a suit 2 people back checked his watch with exaggerated frustration, as if Simone's mere existence and her insistence on occupying the seat she'd paid for was somehow a personal affront to his schedule. Captain Devin Hayes straightened to his full height, a move clearly calculated to emphasize his authority and physical presence, his hand resting on his belt in a gesture that security experts would recognize as an unconscious power pose. "Ma'am, your behavior right now is concerning to me and to my crew. You're creating a disturbance that's making other passengers uncomfortable, and I need you to understand that as captain of this aircraft, I have the final say on who boards and who doesn't." The accusation hit Simone like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs even as her face remained carefully neutral, because in that single sentence, Hayes had rewritten the entire confrontation, transforming her calm and reasonable questions into aggressive behavior, her legitimate documentation into suspicious resistance, her very presence into a threat. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't made a single aggressive gesture, hadn't done anything beyond standing still and presenting evidence that she belonged exactly where she was supposed to be, yet somehow she was now the one being characterized as dangerous. "Captain Hayes, I haven't raised my voice or made any threatening gestures." Simone said her words measured and precise, the lawyer in her knowing that she needed to create a clear record of what was actually happening versus what was being claimed. "I've simply asked to see the documentation for the duplicate booking and presented my own confirmed reservation. That's not creating a disturbance that's trying to resolve a legitimate question about my assigned seat." Jessica, the blonde flight attendant, stepped forward with a theatrical sigh that suggested she'd been dealing with difficult people all day and had finally reached her limit. "I have to agree with the captain. When you approached the aircraft, your demeanor at the gate was aggressive and confrontational. I observed it myself, and I'm concerned about allowing someone with that kind of energy into the cabin where it could escalate during flight." The lie was so blatant, so easily disprovable that for a moment Simone couldn't quite process what was happening, because Jessica had been nowhere near the gate when Simone had checked in, had been standing inside the aircraft the entire time, had literally zero first-hand knowledge of any interaction at the gate itself. "Maria." The actual gate agent gasped audibly at the fabrication, her professional composure cracking, as she witnessed someone casually inventing facts to support a predetermined conclusion. "That's not true," Maria interjected, her voice shaking slightly with the courage it took to contradict a captain and senior flight attendant. "I was the one who processed Dr. Clark at the gate, and she was nothing but professional and courteous. She didn't display any aggressive behavior whatsoever." Captain Hayes turned to Maria with a look that could freeze water, his authority challenged by a ground crew member who had the audacity to contradict his flight crew's assessment. "Miss Torres, I appreciate your input, but this is a flight safety decision and those decisions fall under my purview, not yours. I'm the one responsible for the safety of everyone on this aircraft, and I'm telling you that this passenger is presenting as a security risk that I'm not comfortable accepting." The phrase security risk echoed through the gate area like a grenade, and Simone watched in real time as the passengers around her reassessed everything they'd just witnessed, their faces shifting from discomfort to wariness, from sympathy to suspicion, because those 2 words carried implications that went far beyond a simple seating dispute. Security risk suggested danger, suggested terrorism, suggested violence, suggested everything that Americans had been conditioned to fear in the years since September 11th, and Hayes had deployed those words with the precision of someone who knew exactly what kind of reaction they would provoke. Simone's hands began to tremble, not with fear, but with the effort of containing the rage and humiliation that threatened to overwhelm her careful composure, because she understood with perfect clarity what was happening and what it meant. Captain Devin Hayes had decided the moment he saw her that a black woman didn't belong in first class, had manufactured a reason to deny her boarding, and was now escalating that initial discrimination into something far more damaging, creating a false narrative that could follow her for years, that could end up in databases and watch lists that could turn every future flight into an interrogation. A young flight attendant, a man with kind eyes who'd been standing slightly behind Jessica during the entire confrontation, finally spoke up. His voice hesitant but determined. "Captain, I don't think we should escalate this situation. The passenger has valid documentation, and she hasn't done anything that would constitute a security threat. Maybe we should just verify the booking issue with operations before making any final decisions." His name tag read Aaron, and the look Jessica shot him could have stripped paint a clear warning that he was crossing a line by questioning the captain's judgment. But Aaron held his ground, even as his discomfort was visible in the set of his shoulders and the way he couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes directly. Hayes ignored Aaron entirely, his attention still fixed on Simone with the kind of focused intensity that made it clear he viewed this as a battle of wills he had no intention of losing. "Ma'am, I'm giving you one final opportunity to deplane voluntarily and work with the gate staff to resolve this issue. If you refuse, I will have airport security remove you from the boarding area, and I will file a report documenting your refusal to comply with crew instructions, which I'm sure you know can result in significant consequences, including being banned from this airline entirely." Tyler Preston, still seated in the disputed 2B, pulled his headphones off again and let out a small laugh, not quite loud enough to be openly mocking, but definitely audible, the sound of someone entertained by drama that didn't affect him personally. He muttered something under his breath that might have been unbelievable or ridiculous, his tone suggesting he found the entire situation amusing rather than troubling. And when another first-class passenger glanced at him questioningly, Tyler just shrugged and went back to his phone, having apparently satisfied his curiosity about the disturbance. The moment stretched out, becoming something elastic and strange, as Simone stood at the threshold of the aircraft and felt the weight of every eye in the gate area pressing down on her like a physical force, judging, assessing, deciding what kind of person she was based on a situation that had been engineered specifically to make her look unreasonable. She thought about her grandmother, who'd lived through actual segregation, who'd been denied service at lunch counters and relegated to the back of buses, who'd faced far worse than this, with a dignity that came from knowing that grace under pressure was sometimes the only weapon available to the powerless. Her grandmother had told her once, when Simone was young and angry about some childhood injustice, that getting mad was easy and getting even was satisfying, but getting smart was the only approach that actually changed anything. Don't waste your energy on anger when you can use that same energy to make them regret underestimating you, her grandmother had said, her voice carrying decades of hard-won wisdom. And when you do make your move, make sure it's one they'll never forget and never see coming. Simone felt her racing heartbeat begin to slow, felt the trembling in her hands steady, felt the cold clarity of purpose replace the hot rush of humiliation, because in this moment she had a choice about how to respond, and that choice would determine everything that happened next. She could argue, could demand to speak to supervisors, could threaten lawsuits and social media exposure, could do all the things that Hayes clearly expected her to do, or she could do something he would never anticipate, something that would give her control of this situation instead of letting him maintain the power he'd seized so casually. Captain Hayes. Simone said, her voice dropping to something quiet and level, the tone of someone who'd moved past emotion into calculation. "I'm going to step aside. You're right that this aircraft needs to depart, and I don't want to delay all these passengers any longer than necessary." The captain's face registered surprise for just a fraction of a second before settling back into that expression of smug satisfaction, his posture relaxing slightly as he prepared to accept what he clearly interpreted as a surrender, a confirmation that his authority had been successfully asserted, and the problem had been resolved in the way he'd intended from the beginning. "That's a wise decision, ma'am. I'm sure the gate staff will be able to help you rebook on a later flight." Oh, I won't be rebooking. Simone replied, her words carrying a weight that Hayes couldn't quite interpret, a suggestion of meaning beneath the surface that he was too focused on his victory to fully process. I'll be handling this situation myself, but I want to make sure I have your name correct for my records. Captain Devin Hayes, is that right? Something in her tone must have registered as off because Hayes's eyes narrowed slightly, some instinct warning him that this wasn't quite the capitulation it appeared to be, but his arrogance overrode his caution. That's correct. And you can be assured that I'll be documenting this entire incident in my report, including your initial resistance to crew instructions. I'm sure you will, Simone said already, turning away from the aircraft door, her movements deliberate and controlled. Her head held high as she walked back up the jet bridge toward the terminal. Every step measured and purposeful. Behind her, she heard Jessica's satisfied sigh, heard Hayes telling someone to get the door closed so they could finally push back, heard the collective relief of passengers who were glad the drama was over and they could get on with their journey. Maria, the gate agent, followed Simone partway up the jet bridge, her expression stricken with guilt and helplessness. Dr. Clark, I'm so sorry. That was completely wrong what they did to you. I can help you file a complaint. Get you on the next flight. Something. Anything. Simone turned to look at Maria, seeing the genuine distress in the younger woman's eyes, recognizing someone who'd just watched an injustice unfold and felt powerless to stop it. Maria, you tried to speak up when it mattered, and that took courage. I appreciate that more than you know. But I need you to do me one favor. Anything Maria said immediately. Make note of everything you witnessed here tonight. Write it down while it's fresh with timestamps and details. Keep that record somewhere safe. Simone instructed her legal mind, already assembling pieces of a case that would be built on documentation and evidence. And don't feel bad about what happened. This isn't over, not even close. Back on the aircraft, Captain Hayes settled into his cockpit seat with the satisfied air of someone who'd successfully handled a difficult situation, already mentally composing the report that would justify his actions and paint Simone as the aggressor. He told his co-pilot, a younger man named James, who'd watched the entire confrontation from the flight deck, with growing discomfort that he'd taken care of a problem passenger before it could become an in-flight issue. Tyler Preston stretched out in seat 2B, taking full advantage of the extra space now that the dispute had been resolved in his favor, and ordered a pre-departure beverage from Aaron, who delivered it with mechanical efficiency, despite the sick feeling in his stomach about what he'd just witnessed. Tyler raised his glass in a mock toast to himself, pleased with how things had worked out, completely unconcerned about the woman who'd been denied her rightful seat, so he could enjoy his comfort. In the terminal, Simone found a quiet corner away from the crowds, sat down in a chair with a view of the aircraft that had just rejected her, and pulled out her phone with hands that were now perfectly steady, her mind clear and focused on what needed to happen next. She didn't call the airline's customer service number, didn't compose an angry tweet, didn't do any of the things that Hayes and Jessica probably expected her to do, because she'd learned long ago that the most powerful responses were the ones nobody saw coming. Instead, she opened her secure messaging app and typed a single sentence to Dr. Kendra Morrison, her chief operating officer and closest friend, the person who'd been with her since the beginning of everything they'd built together. Kendra, I need you. Something happened, and we need to move fast. Call my encrypted line immediately. The response came in less than 5 seconds, just 3 words that Simone had known would come because Kendra understood without needing explanation that when Simone used that particular tone, something significant was happening. Calling now. Ready. The encrypted call connected with a soft click, and Kendra's voice came through clear and sharp with the kind of focused concern that came from 10 years of partnership through challenges that would have broken lesser teams. Simone, talk to me. What happened? Simone watched through the terminal windows as the aircraft that had rejected her began its pushback from the gate. the tug vehicle moving it slowly away from the jet bridge, while passengers inside settled in for their flight completely unaware that the woman they'd watched being humiliated was about to alter the course of their journey in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. I was just denied boarding on Apex Airlines Flight 2447 to San Francisco. The captain claimed my confirmed first-class seat was double-booked and called me a security risk when I questioned it. There was a beat of absolute silence on the other end of the line, the kind of quiet that preceded a storm before Kendra's voice came back laced with barely contained fury. He did what? Please tell me you're recording this. Please tell me there were witnesses. Please tell me we have something we can use to bury this airline so deep they'll need archaeological excavation to find their stock price. Multiple witnesses, including a gate agent who tried to defend me and contradicted the flight attendant's false statements about my behavior. Simone confirmed, her voice steady and clinical as she recited the facts like evidence in a deposition. The captain gave my seat to a young white man who's currently enjoying a pre-departure drink in what should have been my seat. They manufactured the entire situation, Kendra, from the false claim of a booking error to the accusation that I was aggressive and threatening when I'd done nothing but present documentation and ask reasonable questions. Kendra's exhale was sharp and angry, and Simone could picture her pacing in her office the way she always did when she was processing information and planning strategy. Okay, we're going to destroy them through legal channels. I'll have our attorneys file discrimination complaints with the Department of Transportation, the FAA civil rights violations, intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation for calling you a security risk with no basis. We'll own this airline by the time we're done with them. Lawsuits take years, and I don't want money, Simone said quietly, her words carrying a weight that made Kendra stop her pacing. I want something faster and more effective. I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else. And I want the people who did this to understand exactly why their lives are about to change. Pull up our files on Apex Airlines and their parent company. The sound of rapid typing came through the phone as Kendra pulled up the information, her brilliant mind already racing ahead to understand where Simone was going with this line of thinking. Apex Regional is a subsidiary of Horizon Aviation Group, one of the big three holdings companies in the commercial aviation space. They operate under several different brand names, mostly focused on regional connecting flights throughout North America. Market cap around $800 million, publicly traded, reasonably profitable. What are you thinking? What contracts do we have with Horizon? Simone asked, though she already knew the answer, had known it the moment she'd seen the Apex Airlines logo, because part of being successful in her field meant knowing exactly who used her company's technology and how dependent they were on that relationship. More typing then, Kendra's sharp intake of breath as she pulled up the relevant files and understood where this was heading. Oh, Simone. We have a $400 million equipment contract with Horizon Aviation Group for emergency medical systems across their entire fleet. Every single one of their aircraft, regardless of which brand name they're flying under, carries Pinnacle Biotech's trauma response kits, automated external defibrillators, oxygen delivery systems, and the neural stabilization unit you developed after that astronaut accident 3 years ago. And when does that contract come up for renewal? Simone asked, though again she already knew had reviewed the contract status just last month during their quarterly business review, had made note of the timeline because Horizon had been hinting they wanted to renegotiate for better terms. 92 days, Kendra replied, and Simone could hear the shift in her voice as she moved from anger to strategic calculation, understanding that they held cards in this game that Horizon Aviation Group had forgotten they'd dealt. The contract has an ethics clause that we insisted on after that incident with the defense contractor. Section 7.3 states that any company found to be enabling or supporting discriminatory practices against protected classes automatically forfeits equipment certification and authorization for use. It was a clause that Simone's legal team had fought hard to include in all their contracts after they'd discovered one of their early partners was involved in some deeply unethical labor practices, and while most companies had signed it without much thought, assuming it would never actually be invoked, Simone had always known it existed as a safeguard for exactly this kind of situation. If we pull that certification, Kendra, what happens to their aircraft? Without our medical equipment certification, the FAA grounds their entire fleet within 48 hours. Kendra said slowly, working through the implications. They can't fly passengers without FAA-approved emergency medical systems on board. And we're the only approved provider for the specific technology they're using. Switching to a different provider would take months of installation testing and recertification. They'd be looking at a complete operational shutdown across every subsidiary, including Apex, including their premium charter services, everything. The financial losses would be catastrophic, probably enough to trigger bankruptcy within weeks. Simone closed her eyes, feeling the weight of what she was considering, because this wasn't just about one captain or one flight attendant or even one airline. This was about wielding power in a way that could destroy thousands of jobs and strand millions of passengers, all because of one incident of discrimination. I don't want to destroy the company, Kendra. Most of the people who work for Horizon had nothing to do with what happened tonight. But I do want them to understand that their culture allowed this to happen, that someone up the chain made decisions that created an environment where a captain felt comfortable casually labeling a black woman as a security threat. So what's the play? Kendra asked, trusting Simone's judgment the way she always had. Knowing that when Simone had that particular tone in her voice, she'd already worked out several moves ahead and just needed someone to help her execute the strategy. Set up an emergency meeting with Lawrence Whitmore, the CEO of Horizon. Simone instructed, her mind clear and focused on the steps that needed to happen. Tonight, within the next 3 hours. Tell him it's regarding immediate compliance issues with our medical equipment contract and that time-sensitive decisions need to be made. Don't mention my name. Don't mention the incident. Just make it clear that we need to discuss the ethics clause, and that the conversation needs to happen before any public actions are taken. He's going to panic when he gets that message, Kendra observed. Emergency meeting about ethics violations from your largest equipment provider is exactly the kind of call that makes CEOs have heart attacks, Good Simone said flatly. Maybe his panic will motivate him to actually listen and take action instead of trying to minimize and deflect the way corporate executives always do when confronted with discrimination in their ranks. And Kendra, while you're setting up that meeting, I need you to pull Captain Devin Hayes' personnel file along with any complaints or incidents that might be buried in HR records. I want to know if this is a pattern or an isolated incident. On it, Kendra confirmed. Simone, are you okay? Stupid question. I know you're not okay, but are you going to be okay? Simone looked out at the darkening sky beyond the terminal windows, at the steady flow of aircraft taking off and landing, at the ordinary miracle of thousands of people moving through the air to destinations all over the world, and felt the exhaustion settle into her bones alongside the determination. I'm tired, Kendra. I'm so tired of having to fight these battles, of having to prove I belong in spaces I've earned the right to occupy. But yes, I'm going to be okay because I'm going to make sure something good comes from this. Something that protects the next person who finds themselves in this situation. Kendra worked with the efficient precision of someone who'd built her career on turning impossible timelines into accomplished facts, her fingers flying across multiple keyboards as she pulled data from secure servers and encrypted files while simultaneously coordinating with their legal team and preparing briefing materials for the upcoming confrontation. The Pinnacle Biotech corporate offices in downtown San Francisco were mostly empty this late in the evening, but the emergency protocols Simone had activated brought key personnel back online within minutes, everyone understanding that when their CEO invoked those codes, something significant was happening. The contract between Pinnacle Biotech and Horizon Aviation Group was a masterpiece of legal complexity spread across 247 pages of technical specifications, performance requirements, and compliance standards. But Kendra zeroed in on the sections that mattered for their current purposes. The ethics clause had been drafted by their counsel 3 years ago, and while it had seemed like paranoid overkill at the time, Simone had insisted on including language that went far beyond the standard corporate social responsibility boilerplate. Found it, Kendra muttered to herself, highlighting the relevant text. Section 7.3, subsection B. Any documented pattern of discriminatory conduct by client company employees, particularly conduct that creates hostile environments for customers or partners of protected classes, constitutes material breach of the ethical standards required for certification of life safety equipment. Provider reserves the right to suspend or revoke equipment authorization pending investigation and remediation of discriminatory practices. The language was deliberately broad, using pattern rather than policy, because Simone had understood that institutional discrimination rarely manifested as written policy, instead emerging through the accumulated actions of individuals operating within a culture that tacitly approved their behavior. One captain's discrimination might be an isolated incident, but if that captain had a history of similar behavior that the company had failed to address, that became a pattern that triggered the ethics violation. Kendra opened a secure channel to their legal team's database system and began running queries against airline industry records, looking for any public complaints or incidents involving Apex Airlines or Horizon Aviation Group that might indicate broader problems. The first search returned 17 results, mostly minor customer service issues and the usual complaints about delays and lost luggage, nothing particularly damning on its own. But then she refined her search parameters, filtering specifically for discrimination complaints, civil rights issues, or incidents involving passengers being denied boarding or removed from aircraft, and the results painted a much more troubling picture. Over the past 3 years, Horizon Aviation Group subsidiaries had faced 11 separate formal complaints filed with the Department of Transportation alleging discriminatory treatment, including 3 that specifically mentioned Apex Airlines and 2 that referenced Captain Devin Hayes by name. The first complaint involving Hayes came from 2 years ago, filed by a Latina passenger who claimed the captain had been dismissive and condescending when she'd asked questions about a flight delay, refusing to provide her with the same information he'd freely shared with other passengers, and suggesting she wouldn't understand the technical details even if he explained them. The airline's response had classified the incident as a misunderstanding arising from language barriers, despite the passenger being a native English speaker and professor of linguistics at UCLA. The second complaint was more recent, just 8 months old, filed by an Asian American businessman who stated that Hayes had questioned his right to be in first class, asking to see his boarding pass multiple times during the flight, and making comments about how he must be doing well for himself, in a tone the passenger described as suspicious and inappropriate. That complaint had been resolved with travel vouchers and a generic apology that acknowledged the passenger's concerns without admitting any fault or taking any apparent disciplinary action against Hayes. Kendra felt her anger building as she read through the complaints, seeing the clear pattern that Horizon's HR department had apparently missed or chosen to ignore each incident treated as separate and unconnected rather than pieces of a larger problem. She pulled Hayes' employment record, next accessing files that Pinnacle's contracts gave them the right to review as part of their safety certification process, and discovered that the captain had been with the airline for 16 years, had mostly positive performance reviews, and had been promoted to senior captain status 5 years ago despite the complaints that were supposedly on his record. But the most damaging discovery came when Kendra cross-referenced the flight crew database and realized that Jessica, the blonde flight attendant who'd made the false accusation about Simone's behavior at the gate, was Jessica Hayes, married to Devin Hayes' younger brother, a nepotism hire. That explained why she'd been so willing to support the captain's narrative, regardless of the truth. Family loyalty and personal bias had combined to create exactly the kind of toxic dynamic that the ethics clause was designed to address. "Oh, you stupid, arrogant people," Kendra whispered to her screen, already compiling the evidence into a presentation that would leave Horizon's CEO with no room to minimize or deny what had happened. You built yourselves a perfect little discrimination machine and never thought anyone would be in a position to hold you accountable. Her phone buzzed with a response from Lawrence Whitmore's executive assistant, confirming that the CEO would make himself available for an emergency video conference in 90 minutes. His tone in the email carrying the barely concealed panic of someone who understood that emergency meetings with critical vendors were never good news. Kendra forwarded the confirmation to Simone along with a summary of her findings, the evidence package that would form the foundation of their ultimatum. Simone, still sitting in the airport terminal, watching the gate that had rejected her, received the files and began reviewing them methodically. Her scientific mind processing the information with the same analytical approach she applied to research data. Each complaint was a data point, each dismissive response from HR was a variable, and the pattern that emerged was as clear as any experimental result she'd ever published. The gate area had emptied significantly in the hour since Simone had been denied boarding, most of the evening departures having pushed back and taken off, leaving behind only a few scattered travelers waiting for late flights and the overnight cleaning crews beginning their rounds. Simone sat alone in a row of chairs facing the windows, her laptop open on the seat beside her displaying the evidence Kendra had compiled, and felt the weight of the decision she was about to make settling over her like a physical presence. The power she was contemplating wielding wasn't abstract or theoretical. It was real and immediate, and would have consequences that rippled far beyond the people who'd wronged her tonight. If she pulled Pinnacle's medical equipment certification from Horizon Aviation Group, the company would have 48 hours to ground every aircraft in their fleet, stranding potentially hundreds of thousands of passengers, eliminating paychecks for thousands of employees who'd done nothing wrong, destroying shareholder value, and possibly triggering a bankruptcy that would reshape the entire regional aviation industry. She thought about the gate agents and baggage handlers and maintenance workers and ticket agents who showed up every day and did their jobs with professionalism, and care people like Maria who'd tried to speak up despite having no power to change anything. People who would lose their livelihoods because of a captain's prejudice and a corporation's failure to address a pattern of discrimination. The possibility that innocent people would suffer as collateral damage in her quest for accountability made her stomach turn, made her question whether she had the right to make this choice regardless of the justification. But then she thought about all the other passengers who'd stood where she stood tonight, who'd faced the same casual cruelty and dismissive authority, who'd been labeled as threatening or suspicious or problematic simply for existing in spaces that someone else had decided they didn't belong in. She thought about the Latina professor who'd been patronized and dismissed, about the Asian businessman who'd been treated like a criminal in his paid seat, about all the complaints that had been filed and forgotten, reduced to vouchers and empty apologies, while the people who'd caused the harm continued in their positions without consequence. Her father had taught her when she was young that privilege came with responsibility, and though he'd been talking about the privilege of education and opportunity, the principle applied equally to the privilege of power. Simone had built Pinnacle Biotech from nothing, had created technology that saved lives and pushed the boundaries of what was possible in emergency medicine, had earned her place in boardrooms and laboratories through brilliance and determination and countless hours of work that most people never saw. That success had given her power, the kind of power that most people who faced discrimination never possessed the ability to fight back, not just for herself, but for everyone who came after. If she walked away from this, if she accepted the humiliation and moved on because using her power felt too extreme or too disruptive, what message did that send to the next passenger who found themselves in this situation? What did it say about her values if she possessed the means to create change but chose not to use them because the consequences might be uncomfortable? Simone pulled out her phone and called her mother, needing to hear the voice of someone who'd known her before she became Dr. Clark, before Pinnacle Biotech, before any of the success that had led her to this moment. Her mother answered on the second ring, her voice warm with surprise and concern because Simone rarely called during business trips unless something was wrong. "Baby, what's happened?" her mother asked immediately, that parental instinct that could detect distress through phone lines and across time zones, cutting straight to the heart of things. Simone told her the story in brief, efficient sentences, recounting the confrontation at the gate and the evidence of patterns and the choice she now faced about how to respond, and her mother listened in silence until Simone finished speaking. "Now I'm sitting here trying to decide if what I'm planning to do is justice or just revenge dressed up in righteous language. And I honestly don't know anymore." Her mother was quiet for a long moment, and Simone could picture her in the house where she'd grown up, could see her sitting in the kitchen with her reading glasses pushed up on her head, considering her response with the same careful thought she'd always brought to difficult conversations. "Your grandmother used to tell me that the difference between justice and revenge was who benefited from the action. Revenge makes you feel better but doesn't change anything for anyone else. Justice makes things better for the next person who walks through that door, even if you never feel better yourself. So the question," her mother continued, "isn't whether what you're planning is too harsh or too disruptive. The question is whether it creates actual change that protects other people, or whether it just satisfies your anger without fixing the problem that made you angry in the first place. You're going to have to answer that for yourself. But I know my daughter, and I know you didn't build a company around saving lives just to use your power to hurt people when you got hurt." Simone felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, the emotional control she'd maintained throughout the evening finally cracking just slightly in the safety of her mother's voice and wisdom. "I don't want to hurt innocent people, Mama. But I also can't just let this go like it doesn't matter, like I'm supposed to absorb this and move on because fighting back might be inconvenient for a corporation that failed to protect its customers." "Then don't let it go," her mother said firmly. "But make sure whatever you do leads somewhere better than where we are now. Make them fix what's broken. Make them accountable. Make them understand that this kind of behavior has consequences. Just don't become so focused on punishment that you forget the point is prevention." After the call ended, Simone sat with her mother's words settling into her bones, alongside her own convictions, and felt the clarity she'd been seeking finally crystallize into certainty. She wasn't going to destroy Horizon Aviation Group, but she was going to force them to confront their failures and make meaningful changes. Changes that would be painful and expensive and disruptive, because anything less than that would be too easy to ignore once the immediate crisis passed. She opened her secure messaging app and sent a single line to Kendra Morrison's schedule the meeting. "Prepare the full ethics violation documentation. We're going to give Whitmore one chance to fix this the right way before we make the decision for him." Lawrence Whitmore prided himself on being the kind of CEO who stayed calm under pressure, who could navigate labor disputes and fuel price spikes and competitive challenges with the steady hand that came from 25 years in the aviation industry. But the message from Pinnacle Biotech's COO, requesting an emergency meeting about ethics violations, had shattered his composure in ways he hadn't experienced since the early days of the pandemic, when his company had nearly collapsed under travel restrictions. He stood in his home office in Connecticut, still wearing the golf shirt and khakis from his afternoon on the course, staring at his computer screen, while his mind raced through every possible scenario that could have triggered this kind of urgent contact from a vendor whose technology was literally essential to his company's ability to operate. Ethics violations could mean anything from labor practices to environmental compliance to financial irregularities, and the fact that Pinnacle was demanding immediate discussion rather than going through normal channels suggested something serious enough to threaten their contract. "Get me Rachel Carter in operations." Whitmore barked into his phone, pacing back and forth across his office while he waited for his VP of operations to connect. "And find out if there were any incidents today involving our aircraft, any accidents or medical emergencies or safety issues that might have triggered a vendor concern." Rachel came on the line 60 seconds later, her voice crisp and efficient, despite the late hour, because senior executives in aviation learned early in their careers that emergencies didn't respect business hours or weekends. Sir, I've checked with all our regional operations centers and we've had no medical emergencies, no equipment failures, no incidents that would have involved Pinnacle's systems. Everything has been running normally across the fleet today. Then, why Whitmore said slowly, each word precisely articulated through clenched teeth, is our largest medical equipment vendor demanding an emergency meeting tonight about ethics violations in our organization. When vendors invoke ethics clauses, Rachel, they're usually about to cancel contracts or report us to regulators. So, I need to know what they think we did wrong before I walk into this call. Blind. Rachel was silent for a moment, and Whitmore could hear the rapid clicking of keyboard keys as she searched through incident reports and daily summaries looking for anything that might explain the crisis. Sir, there was one passenger removal this evening at JFK and Apex flight to San Francisco. Captain Devin Hayes denied boarding to a passenger who claimed to have a confirmed first-class seat. The gate report says there was a dispute about the seat assignment and the captain made a safety decision to refuse boarding. Something cold settled into Whitmore's stomach, an instinct born from years of crisis management telling him that this seemingly routine incident was anything but routine, if it had somehow reached the attention of Pinnacle Biotech. What was the passenger's name? More typing then. Rachel's sharp intake of breath that told Whitmore everything he needed to know before she even spoke. Dr. Simone Clark. Sir, Dr. Simone Clark is the founder and CEO of Pinnacle Biotech. The words hit Whitmore like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs, as the full implications of what had happened crashed down on him with the force of an aircraft falling from the sky. One of his captains had denied boarding to the CEO of the company that supplied critical life safety equipment to his entire fleet had apparently created enough of a situation that she was now invoking ethics clauses and demanding emergency meetings had potentially handed Horizon Aviation Group the kind of existential crisis that could end with their bankruptcy and his termination. "Pull Captain Hayes' personnel file right now," Whitmore ordered, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "I want to know everything about this incident, every detail, every witness statement, every piece of documentation, and get Hayes on the phone immediately. I don't care if he's in the air or on the ground or in the middle of dinner. You find him, and you get him on a call with me in the next 10 minutes. He hung up and immediately dialed his chief legal counsel, Arthur Bennett, who answered on the fourth ring with the groggy confusion of someone who'd been asleep and wasn't entirely sure whether he was being called for a real emergency or a nightmare. "Arthur, we have a situation that could end this company, and I need you awake and sharp in about 30 seconds, so splash some water on your face and listen carefully." As Whitmore explained the situation in terse, clipped sentences, he pulled up information about Dr. Simone Clark on his computer, seeing for the first time the woman his captain had casually dismissed, and felt sick as he read through her credentials and accomplishments. Stanford Ph.D. holder of 17 patents in emergency medical technology, frequent speaker at aerospace medicine conferences, recipient of the NASA Exceptional Public Service Medal for her work on life support systems, net worth estimated in the billions because her privately held company had become essential infrastructure for an entire industry. This wasn't just a wronged passenger with the resources to make their life difficult through lawsuits and bad publicity. This was someone who held the power to literally ground their entire fleet and destroy their company through perfectly legal exercise of contractual rights that Whitmore had signed without fully appreciating the leverage he was handing over. "Arthur, she can pull our medical equipment certification, and we'd have 48 hours before the FAA grounds every aircraft we operate. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me there's some legal protection we have against that scenario." Arthur Bennett, now fully awake and clearly reviewing the same contracts on his own computer, delivered the news that Whitmore had already known in his gut was coming. "Sir, if they invoke the ethics violation clause and can demonstrate a pattern of discriminatory conduct, we have no legal recourse to prevent them from suspending our equipment authorization. The contract was reviewed by our legal team when we signed it, and apparently we agreed to those terms because the technology was essential, and we didn't think the clause would ever actually be used. Whitmore sank into his desk chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 58 years, and thought about the empire he'd spent decades building, the tens of thousands of employees who depended on Horizon Aviation Group for their livelihoods, the millions of passengers who relied on their service to connect communities across North America, all of it potentially destroyed because a captain had looked at a black woman and decided she didn't belong in first class. Find out everything about Devin Hayes, Whitmore said quietly, his voice carrying the exhausted finality of someone who already knew what the investigation would reveal. Every complaint, every incident, every piece of his record that should have been flagged before tonight. And get the HR director on the line, because if we've been sitting on a pattern of discrimination without addressing it, I need to know that before I talk to Dr. Clark. Flight 2447 had been sitting at the gate with its doors sealed for 47 minutes, well past its scheduled departure time, and the mood in the cabin had shifted from mild annoyance to active frustration as passengers checked their watches and connections and calculated how this delay would cascade through their carefully planned itineraries. Tyler Preston, still sprawled in seat 2B with his expensive headphones and his sense of entitlement intact, had progressed from irritated to actively hostile, repeatedly pressing his call button and demanding explanations that the remaining flight crew couldn't provide because they genuinely had no idea what was causing the operational hold. Captain Devin Hayes sat in the cockpit feeling the first stirrings of unease, as the delay stretched beyond anything he'd experienced in 16 years of flying his requests for clarification from operations, met with vague assurances that they were working on resolving an issue and would provide updates as soon as possible. His co-pilot, a younger man named Michael Chen, who'd witnessed the boarding confrontation with Simone Clark, and felt deeply uncomfortable about what he'd seen, maintained professional silence, but couldn't quite hide the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes kept flicking to the cockpit door, as if expecting trouble to arrive at any moment. Aaron, the flight attendant who'd briefly tried to speak up during the confrontation, moved through the cabin with mechanical efficiency, collecting trash and offering apologies. He couldn't explain his internal distress growing with each passing minute, because some instinct told him that this unprecedented delay was connected to the woman they'd turned away. Though he couldn't imagine how a denied passenger could cause an entire aircraft to be held at the gate. In the first-class cabin, an older businessman who'd witnessed the earlier confrontation leaned across the aisle to his traveling companion and spoke in a low voice that still carried in the quiet cabin. "You know what this is about, don't you? That woman they refused to board. I bet she made enough noise that corporate is scrambling to figure out how to handle it. Probably threatening lawsuits, probably called every civil rights organization she could think of. Probably playing the race card for everything it's worth." His companion nodded in agreement, both men secure in their assessment that the delay was somehow the fault of the woman who'd been wronged rather than the people who'd wronged her, that comfortable worldview where victims who complained about mistreatment were the real problem because their complaints created inconvenience for everyone else. Tyler Preston, overhearing this conversation, felt a small twinge of something that might have been guilt if he'd been capable of that particular emotion. But he pushed it down and focused instead on his annoyance at being delayed on the important meetings he was going to be late for, on anything except the possibility that he'd played a role in creating this situation. Jessica, conspicuously absent from the cabin, despite being scheduled as the senior flight attendant for this service, had taken refuge in the rear galley. Her earlier confidence replaced by growing anxiety as she checked her phone repeatedly and saw an increasing number of missed calls from her brother-in-law, Captain Hayes, and from numbers she didn't recognize but suspected were connected to whatever was happening. She'd known when she'd backed up Hayes's false accusation about Simone's aggressive behavior that she was stretching the truth, but she'd told herself it was for safety reasons, that supporting her husband's brother was just family loyalty, that this kind of thing happened all the time, and never led to real consequences. Now, standing in the cramped galley while the aircraft sat inexplicably grounded, and passengers grew increasingly hostile with their demands for information. Jessica felt the first cold fingers of real fear creeping up her spine as she considered the possibility that her casual lie might actually matter, might have been documented and recorded, and might come back to haunt her in ways she'd never anticipated when the words had left her mouth so easily. The gate area outside the aircraft had filled with Horizon Aviation Group personnel over the past 15 minutes. More supervisors and managers than Aaron had ever seen assembled for a routine departure, all of them wearing expressions that ranged from confused to grimly determined. All of them speaking in hushed, urgent tones that suggested something significant was happening just out of sight of the passengers trapped in their seats, waiting for explanations that never came. Maria, the gate agent, who'd tried unsuccessfully to defend Simone during the confrontation, stood at her podium fielding increasingly angry questions from passengers' family members who'd been waiting at the San Francisco arrival gate and wanted to know why the flight was now showing a 2-hour delay with no explanation. She'd written down everything she'd witnessed as Simone had requested, had sent the detailed account to her supervisor along with a formal complaint about Hayes' conduct, and now watched with a mixture of vindication and anxiety as the corporate machinery finally began to respond to what she'd known immediately was a serious incident. In the aircraft cockpit, Hayes' radio crackled with a new message from operations, the tone markedly different from the earlier vague assurances, now carrying an edge of formality that made his stomach clench with sudden apprehension. Apex 2447 operations. Captain Hayes, you are instructed to maintain position at the gate and await arrival of company representatives. Do not repeat. Do not commence departure procedures. Acknowledge. Hayes exchanged a worried glance with his co-pilot, his earlier satisfaction about handling a difficult passenger situation now curdling into genuine concern because he'd never received an order phrased quite like that, had never been told to wait for company representatives in the middle of what should have been a routine departure. Operations Apex 2447 acknowledged. Can you provide any additional information about the nature of this hold? Negative. Apex 2447. Maintain position. Operations out. The video conference connected at exactly the time Kendra Morrison had specified the screen filling with Lawrence Whitmore's face, and Simone noted with professional detachment that the CEO of Horizon Aviation Group looked like a man who'd already had a very bad evening and knew it was about to get worse. He'd changed from whatever casual clothes he'd been wearing into a business shirt and tie, that instinctive corporate armor people donned when they needed to feel in control, and behind him she could see what appeared to be a home office, hastily prepared for an emergency call. Dr. Clark Whitmore began, his voice carefully modulated to project calm authority, despite the tension visible in his shoulders and the way his eyes kept darting to something off-screen, probably notes or briefing materials his team had frantically assembled. Thank you for making time for this discussion. I understand there was an unfortunate incident this evening involving one of our flights, and I want you to know that Horizon Aviation Group takes any passenger concerns extremely seriously. Simone sat in a private conference room at the airport's executive center, flanked by Kendra Morrison, and two attorneys from their corporate counsel's office, her own appearance calm and professional, despite the exhaustion that pulled at her bones and the anger that still simmered beneath her controlled exterior. Mr. Whitmore, let's dispense with the corporate pleasantries and address what actually happened. Your captain, Devin Hayes, denied my confirmed first-class boarding, gave my seat to another passenger, falsely accused me of aggressive behavior. I never displayed and labeled me a security risk in front of witnesses, despite having zero legitimate basis for that characterization. Whitmore's carefully constructed composure flickered for just a moment, a micro-expression of genuine alarm crossing his face, before he schooled it back to neutral concern. Dr. Clark, I can only apologize for what sounds like a completely unacceptable situation. I can assure you that we'll conduct a thorough investigation and appropriate action will be taken if the facts support your account of events. The facts absolutely support my account because there were multiple witnesses, including your own gate agent, who tried to contradict the false statements your flight attendant made." Simone said, her voice still level, but now carrying an edge of steel that came from years of dealing with corporate executives who thought they could minimize and deflect their way out of accountability. "But that's not why we're having this emergency meeting, Mr. Whitmore. We're having this meeting because what happened to me tonight wasn't an isolated incident. It was the predictable result of a pattern of discriminatory conduct that your company has failed to address despite having multiple opportunities to do so." She nodded to Kendra, who shared her screen with the conference call, displaying the first of several documents. They'd prepared a timeline of complaints filed against Horizon Aviation Group subsidiaries over the past 3 years, with specific emphasis on incidents involving Captain Devin Hayes. Whitmore's face went pale as he reviewed the information, clearly seeing some of these complaints for the first time, his eyes widening as he absorbed the implications of having a documented pattern that his HR department had apparently treated as separate, unconnected incidents, rather than pieces of a larger problem. Captain Hayes has been the subject of at least 2 prior complaints alleging discriminatory conduct and inappropriate treatment of passengers from minority backgrounds. Simone continued, her words precise and damning. Both complaints were resolved with travel vouchers and generic apologies that acknowledged nothing and changed nothing. "Your flight attendant this evening, Jessica Hayes, is married to Captain Hayes's brother, a nepotism hire who was willing to make false statements to support her brother-in-law's narrative, regardless of the truth." Whitmore's hands were visibly shaking now as he tried to process the information being presented, tried to calculate how much of this his legal team had known or should have known, tried to understand how a situation this damaging had been allowed to develop without anyone raising alarm bells at a level senior enough to actually force change. "Dr. Clark, I was not aware of the specifics you're describing. If there has been a failure in our HR processes to properly flag and address these patterns, that represents a serious lapse that I will personally ensure is corrected," Mr. Whitmore Simone said, quietly, leaning forward slightly so her face filled more of the camera frame. "I don't particularly care about your HR processes or your personal assurances. I care about results, about actual, meaningful change that prevents the next passenger from being humiliated the way I was tonight. So I'm going to be very clear about what needs to happen, and you're going to have a choice about whether to accept these terms or face the consequences of refusing." She outlined her requirements with the precision of someone who'd spent the past hour thinking through exactly what accountability should look like, each demand specific and actionable, rather than vague promises of improvement. Captain Devin Hayes would be terminated immediately, his employment ending tonight before he completed the flight he was currently supposed to be operating. Jessica Hayes would face the same termination for making false statements in support of discriminatory conduct. Every discrimination complaint filed against Horizon Aviation Group in the past 5 years would be reopened and investigated by an independent third party with public reporting of findings and actions taken. Additionally, Simone continued watching Whitmore's face grow increasingly ashen as the requirements accumulated. Horizon will implement mandatory bias training for all flight crew and management conducted by recognized experts in the field, not some pro forma online module that people click through without learning anything. You'll establish an independent oversight board with real authority to review discrimination complaints and enforce consequences with members who have no financial or employment relationship with your company. And you'll create a passenger bill of rights that clearly outlines what recourse people have when they experience discriminatory treatment, with timelines and accountability measures that can't be buried by corporate bureaucracy. Whitmore's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak, his voice, now stripped of its earlier attempts at authoritative calm, reduced to the pleading tone of someone who'd realized exactly how much power they'd ceded in a contract they'd signed without fully understanding. "Dr. Clark, Some of what you're asking, the timeline you're suggesting, it's not realistic to implement that kind of comprehensive change in a matter of hours. These things take time. They require negotiations with unions. They need board approval for funding. They can't just happen overnight because we want them to. You have 2 hours, Simone said, her words landing like a judge's gavel. 2 hours to implement the terminations and begin the process of establishing the oversight mechanisms. The full implementation timeline can be longer, but the commitment to these changes needs to be formalized tonight in writing with specific deadlines and consequences for failure to meet them. And if we need more time? Whitmore asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Kendra spoke for the first time, her voice crisp and professional as she shared another document that appeared on the conference screen, the medical equipment contract between Pinnacle Biotech and Horizon Aviation Group, with Section 7.3 highlighted in unmissable yellow. If these terms aren't accepted within the specified time frame, Mr. Whitmore, we will invoke the ethics violation clause of our equipment contract. Effective immediately, Pinnacle Biotech will suspend certification for all medical systems currently installed on Horizon aircraft, which means the FAA will ground your entire fleet within 48 hours pending installation and certification of replacement equipment from alternative providers. The financial impact of a complete operational shutdown would be catastrophic. One of Simone's attorneys added his tone almost apologetic as he outlined the death spiral that would follow such a grounding. We estimate Horizon Aviation Group would be facing bankruptcy within 3 weeks, with immediate consequences for your stock price, your ability to meet debt obligations, and the livelihoods of your 30,000 employees. Whitmore looked like he might be sick, his face now fully drained of color as the full weight of the ultimatum pressed down on him, as he understood that the woman his captain had casually dismissed held the power to destroy his company through legitimate exercise of contractual rights that he'd never imagined would actually be invoked. Dr. Clark, please understand that I'm not trying to minimize what happened to you or avoid accountability. But what you're asking me to do, the speed at which you're demanding it, could have serious consequences for thousands of people who had nothing to do with tonight's incident. Mr. Whitmore, Simone replied, and for the first time her voice carried a hint of the emotion she'd been suppressing all evening. The exhaustion and anger and bone-deep weariness of fighting battles that should never have needed fighting. Those thousands of innocent people work for a company that created an environment where Captain Hayes felt comfortable treating me the way he did. They work for a company that ignored complaints and protected problem employees and prioritized avoiding liability over actually addressing discrimination. The consequences they might face aren't my fault. They're the fault of leadership that failed them by allowing this culture to persist. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing in a softer but no less determined voice. I don't want to destroy your company, I really don't. Most of the people who work for Horizon are probably good people doing their jobs with integrity. But those good people deserve better leadership than what you've provided, and your passengers deserve better protection than what your current systems offer. So yes, what I'm asking is disruptive and uncomfortable, and probably feels impossibly fast, but I'm asking it because anything less than that won't actually change anything. The silence stretched out for several seconds before Whitmore finally nodded, the defeated gesture of someone who'd realized they had no good options, only choices between different types of damage. What do you need from me to begin implementing these changes? Simone felt no triumph in watching Lawrence Whitmore's capitulation, only a weary satisfaction that came from knowing she'd leveraged her power in service of something larger than personal vindication. Though she knew that framing it that way to herself was at least partly an attempt to justify actions that still felt uncomfortably close to revenge, regardless of how she dressed them up in the language of justice and accountability. She pulled up a document her legal team had prepared during the meeting, a formal agreement that outlined each requirement with specific timelines and measurable outcomes, the kind of contract that would be legally binding and publicly discoverable if Horizon failed to uphold their commitments. Mr. Whitmore, I'm sharing with you now a memorandum of understanding that formalizes everything we've discussed. Simone explained, watching his screen as the document populated with its dense paragraphs of legal language and implementation schedules. This agreement commits Horizon Aviation Group to the immediate terminations. We discussed the establishment of independent oversight within 60 days, completion of the complaint review process within 90 days, and full implementation of the bias training and passenger bill of rights within 6 months. Whitmore scrolled through the document with the careful attention of someone who understood that signing this agreement would fundamentally reshape his company's operations and probably cost him his own job once the board understood the circumstances that had forced these concessions. The termination of Captain Hayes the Boros understand the necessity given the pattern of complaints. But you're also asking me to fire Jessica Hayes tonight based primarily on her false statement about your behavior at the gate. Won't that be difficult to prove without more investigation? Kendra Morrison leaned into frame her expression, conveying the kind of barely restrained anger that came from watching someone try to negotiate away accountability, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Mr. Whitmore, we have witness testimony from your own gate agent directly contradicting Jessica Hayes' statement. We have video footage from airport security cameras that shows Dr. Clark's demeanor and interactions at the gate. We have testimony from passengers who observed the entire confrontation. Jessica Hayes deliberately lied to support discriminatory conduct, and that lie was material to Captain Hayes' decision to escalate the situation. If you're having trouble understanding why that warrants immediate termination, perhaps you need to reconsider whether you're the right person to lead the cultural change your company desperately needs. The sharp rebuke hit home, and Whitmore visibly recoiled before nodding his understanding. You're right. I apologize. I'm not trying to protect people who don't deserve protection. I'm just trying to understand how to implement all of this without destroying the company in the process. What about the operational impact? Flight 2447 is still at the gate waiting to depart with passengers on board. If I terminate Captain Hayes immediately, that flight doesn't have a crew and those passengers don't have a way to get to San Francisco tonight. Then I suggest you find another crew, Simone said flatly, because Captain Hayes is not flying another passenger on a Horizon aircraft starting right now. Your operations team has replacement pilots on call for exactly these kinds of situations. And if there's a delay in departure while you bring in that crew, that delay is the direct result of Hayes' conduct, not my response to it. The passengers will be inconvenienced, and I'm sure they'll be frustrated, but they'll be safer flying with a crew that hasn't demonstrated a pattern of discriminatory behavior. One of Simone's attorneys jumped in with a practical suggestion that acknowledged the operational realities while maintaining the firm boundary they'd established. To minimize passenger impact, Horizon could announce that the delay is due to a crew-related compliance issue that requires immediate resolution. Offer compensation to all passengers on the flight, significant compensation that demonstrates this isn't routine, and make it clear that the delay is necessary to ensure their safety and the integrity of your operations. Frame it as you taking decisive action to maintain standards, which has the advantage of being true. Whitmore was making notes, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he presumably drafted messages to his operations team and HR department and legal counsel coordinating the complex choreography that would be required to execute these changes in the abbreviated timeline they'd been given. Dr. Clark, I need to ask you directly. If we implement these changes in good faith, if we meet every deadline and demonstrate real commitment to addressing the cultural problems you've identified, will you maintain our medical equipment contract? Will Pinnacle Biotech continue to work with Horizon, or is this relationship damaged beyond repair? It was a fair question, and Simone took a moment before answering, because she needed to be honest with herself about whether she could continue doing business with a company that had wronged her so profoundly, whether the changes they were agreeing to tonight would be enough to overcome the visceral memory of standing at that aircraft door and being labeled a security risk in front of strangers who'd already decided she was guilty of something just by existing. If you do the work, if you genuinely transform your culture rather than just implementing superficial compliance measures to satisfy this agreement, then yes, we can continue our business relationship. But understand that we'll be watching closely that any backsliding or failure to meet your commitments will result in immediate contract termination, and that I will personally be reviewing the Independent Oversight Board's reports to ensure this isn't just corporate theater designed to appease a vendor who held a gun to your head. Fair enough, Whitmore replied, and for the first time since the call began, his voice carried something that might have been respect alongside the fear and desperation that had characterized most of his responses. Dr. Clark, I want you to know that whatever you might think of me after tonight, I genuinely am committed to fixing what's broken in my organization. I built this company over 25 years, and the idea that we've been allowing discrimination to flourish under my watch is killing me. I should have known I should have created systems that made this kind of pattern impossible to hide, and the fact that I didn't represents a failure of leadership that I take full responsibility for. Simone studied his face through the video connection, looking for signs of sincerity versus the kind of performed contrition that executives deployed when they'd been caught and needed to manage public relations, and she saw something in his expression that suggested he might actually mean what he was saying, might actually be capable of the kind of genuine self-examination that could lead to real change. Then prove it, she said simply. Prove it through your actions over the next 6 months and the next 6 years. Prove it by creating an organization where what happened to me tonight becomes literally unthinkable rather than just unlikely. Prove it by being the kind of leader who doesn't need to be threatened with catastrophic consequences to do the right thing. Kendra drove Simone back to JFK in a hired car, the streets of Manhattan sliding past the windows in a blur of lights and late evening traffic, neither woman speaking much because there wasn't much left to say. After the intensity of the past few hours had finally begun to recede, leaving behind the hollow exhaustion that came after adrenaline finally gave way to the bone-deep weariness of emotional labor performed under impossible pressure. Simone leaned her head against the cool glass of the window and watched the city pass by, thinking about everything that had happened. And everything that was about to happen, the cascade of consequences that would ripple out from this night in ways she probably couldn't fully anticipate yet. "You okay?" Kendra asked finally. Her voice soft with concern that went beyond professional worry that came from 10 years of friendship that had survived the stress of building a company and the challenges of navigating an industry that didn't always welcome their presence or value their contributions. Simone considered the question seriously, taking inventory of her emotional state, the way she might assess the results of a complex experiment, looking for patterns and outliers and unexpected reactions. I hate that it came to this. I hate that I had to threaten someone's entire company and thousands of jobs just to force accountability for something that should never have happened in the first place. I hate that Captain Hayes made me into someone who wields power like a weapon instead of someone who just wanted to fly home in the seat she paid for and be left alone. "But you're going to be okay," Kendra said. Not quite a question more, an affirmation that she needed Simone to confirm. "I'm tired," Kendra Simone admitted, and saying it out loud made the exhaustion feel more real, more permissible, because she'd been holding herself together through sheer force of will. And now, in the safety of Kendra's presence, she could finally acknowledge how much this night had cost her. "I'm tired of having to be exceptional, just to be treated as equal. I'm tired of having to fight battles that white men never have to fight, because nobody questions their right to exist in premium spaces or professional positions or anywhere else they decide they belong. I'm tired of turning every slight and every microaggression into a teaching moment or a case study in discrimination, when I just want to live my life without constantly having to prove my humanity to people who should know better." Kendra reached across the car and squeezed Simone's hand, offering silent comfort that acknowledged the weight of what she was carrying, and they rode the rest of the way to the airport in a silence that was companionable rather than uncomfortable, both women processing the evening in their own ways. When they arrived at Terminal B, Simone saw that the gate area for Flight 2447 had transformed into a hub of activity with Horizon Aviation Group personnel moving purposefully through the space, while passengers from the delayed flight milled around, looking confused and frustrated by the continued wait and lack of clear information. Simone approached the gate desk where Maria, the agent who'd tried to help her hours earlier, was coordinating with several supervisors, and Maria's face lit up with a complex mixture of emotions when she saw who was approaching relief and vindication and sympathy, all competing for expression in her eyes. "Dr. Clark, I'm so glad you came back. I wasn't sure if you would, but I've been hoping you'd return because I wanted to thank you for what you did for standing up and making them actually address what happened, instead of just accepting an apology and moving on." "Maria, you're the one who deserves thanks," Simone replied warmly, meaning every word because she understood how much courage it had taken for a gate agent with no power or protection to contradict a captain and senior flight attendant when the truth needed to be told. "You spoke up when it mattered even though you knew it might cost you. That's the kind of integrity that actually makes a difference, and I hope your company recognizes how valuable that kind of employee is." Maria looked like she might cry, her professional composure cracking just slightly as the validation from someone who mattered hit home in ways that the routine praise from supervisors never quite managed to achieve. "The flight is still held, but they told us there would be a crew change and we should have a new departure time within the next 30 minutes. Whatever you did, Dr. Clark, it's having an impact because I've never seen this level of management attention on a single incident before." Simone nodded, understanding that Maria probably didn't know the full scope of what had been set in motion tonight, but was witnessing the visible effects of consequences finally catching up to people who'd operated without accountability for far too long. She found a seat in the gate area where she could watch the aircraft that had rejected her. The jet bridge now reconnected as personnel moved on and off the plane in purposeful patterns that suggested significant changes were happening inside. Through the windows, she could see ground crew preparing the aircraft for the departure that had been delayed by hours. Now could see the lights of other planes taking off and landing in the steady rhythm of an airport that never quite slept. Could see the reflection of her own face in the glass, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, somewhere between triumph and sadness and exhaustion and determination. Her phone buzzed with a message from Kendra, who'd gone to coordinate with the Horizon operations team about the logistics of what would happen next. A brief update that confirmed Captain Hayes was being escorted from the aircraft and would be met by HR representatives who would handle his termination paperwork tonight. Another message came through from Lawrence Whitmore himself, addressed formally, but with an undertone of what Simone thought might be genuine contrition rather than just corporate damage control, informing her that both Hayes and Jessica Hayes were being terminated effective immediately, and that replacement crew had been located and were en route to JFK to take over Flight 2447. He ended with a promise that she would receive written confirmation of all the commitments they'd discussed within the hour, along with a public statement that would go out to all Horizon employees and passengers explaining the actions being taken to address discriminatory conduct in their organization. The announcement came over the gate speakers with the crisp formality of someone reading from a carefully prepared script. Words that had probably been reviewed by lawyers and PR specialists to ensure they conveyed the necessary information without exposing the company to additional liability. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the extended delay of Flight 2447 to San Francisco. We have experienced a necessary crew change due to a conduct violation that came to light this evening. A replacement crew is currently en route and will arrive shortly to complete this service. In recognition of the inconvenience this has caused, all passengers on this flight will receive a full refund of their ticket price as well as a voucher for future travel. We appreciate your patience and understanding." The words "conduct violation" hung in the air, and Simone watched the faces of passengers in the gate area as they processed this unexpected information, their annoyance at the delay now mixing with curiosity about what kind of violation would result in a crew being pulled from service mid-departure and passengers receiving unprecedented compensation. Two men in Horizon Aviation Group uniforms, clearly security or management, rather than flight crew based on their bearing and the identification badges they wore, boarded the aircraft through the jet bridge, and the passengers with window seats could see them moving purposefully down the aisle toward the cockpit. Tyler Preston, still seated in the disputed 2B and increasingly anxious about how this delay was affecting his schedule and his own sense of control over the situation, pulled off his headphones as he sensed the shift in atmosphere around him, the way other first-class passengers were leaning into the aisle to see what was happening. Their earlier comfort in the premium cabin, now replaced by an unsettled awareness that something significant and unusual was unfolding around them. The cockpit door opened and Captain Devin Hayes emerged, his face flushed with anger and confusion. His uniform still crisp, but his composure completely shattered as he found himself being escorted down the aisle like a common criminal rather than the authority figure he'd been just hours earlier. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Hayes protested, his voice carrying through the cabin with the kind of bluster that came from someone who still couldn't quite believe that consequences were actually happening to him. "I made a judgment call about a passenger who was presenting as a security concern, which is exactly what I'm trained and authorized to do as captain of this aircraft. You can't terminate me for following safety protocols." One of the security officers, a woman with steel gray hair and the weathered expression of someone who'd seen every kind of workplace drama aviation could produce, responded in a voice that was quiet but absolutely implacable. "Captain Hayes, your employment with Horizon Aviation Group has been terminated effective immediately for violation of the company's non-discrimination policies and making false statements in your incident report. You'll need to collect your personal belongings and exit the aircraft. Your final paycheck and severance information will be provided according to your contract terms." The passengers watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded, their phones now coming out to document this unprecedented moment. And Simone knew that within hours, there would be videos circulating on social media showing Captain Hayes being escorted off his own aircraft. The visual evidence of accountability that would be impossible for Horizon to minimize or spin, regardless of whatever official statements they released. Hayes walked past the rows of first-class seats, his face now pale as the reality of his situation began to penetrate the initial shock and anger, and his eyes landed for just a moment on Tyler Preston occupying seat 2B, the seat that had started this entire cascade of consequences. Ms. Hayes, the security officer, continued, and Jessica emerged from the rear galley where she'd been hiding since the operational hold had first been announced, her face streaked with tears, and her earlier confidence completely evaporated as she understood that her casual lie in support of her brother-in-law's discrimination had just cost her the career she'd spent 5 years building. "Your employment is also terminated effective immediately. Please collect your belongings and exit the aircraft." Jessica walked down the aisle behind Hayes, refusing to make eye contact with anyone, her hands shaking as she gripped her purse and her mind probably racing through all the ways her life had just changed, all the explanations she would have to give to her husband and her family and future employers when they asked why she'd been fired from an airline job for cause. Aaron, the flight attendant who'd tried to speak up during the initial confrontation, stood pressed against the galley wall as his colleagues were escorted past his face, reflecting a complex mixture of relief that the toxic dynamic he'd been working under was finally being addressed, and guilt that he hadn't done more to prevent this situation before it reached crisis point. The aircraft door remained open as Hayes and Jessica were escorted up the jet bridge and into the terminal, and Simone watched from her seat in the gate area as they emerged into the public space. Hayes still protesting to anyone who would listen while Jessica walked silently with her head down, both of them now navigating the immediate consequences of choices they'd made without fully considering that the woman they'd dismissed might have the power and the will to hold them accountable. Hayes' eyes swept the gate area and landed on Simone, and for just a moment they made direct eye contact, his expression cycling through recognition and disbelief and dawning horror, as he finally understood who she was and what he'd done and how completely he'd miscalculated the cost of his casual prejudice. The gate area gradually quieted after Hayes and Jessica had been escorted away by security passengers returning to their phones and magazines and quiet conversations while they waited for the replacement crew that would finally allow their delayed flight to depart. But there was a new quality to the silence now, an awareness that something significant had just occurred, even if most of them didn't fully understand what it meant or how it connected to the woman who'd been denied boarding hours earlier. The Horizon Aviation Group supervisor who'd been coordinating the crew change approached the gate desk and had a brief consultation with Maria, glancing several times in Simone's direction with an expression that suggested uncertainty about how to proceed with the next part of whatever plan had been developed during the emergency calls and hurried consultations that had consumed the past few hours. Finally, the supervisor took the microphone and cleared his throat, his voice carrying that particular blend of corporate formality and genuine discomfort that came from someone who'd been given a script to read but wasn't entirely sure how the passengers would react to what he was about to say. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Horizon Aviation Group and Apex Airlines, I want to personally apologize for the delay you've experienced this evening. As I mentioned earlier, we discovered a conduct violation by members of our flight crew that required immediate action to address. He paused, seeming to gather himself for what came next, and Simone understood that whatever had been decided about how to handle her return to the aircraft, it was about to be made public in a way that would either vindicate her or create an entirely new form of spectacle. Earlier this evening, one of our passengers was incorrectly denied boarding due to false information provided by crew members who have since been terminated. That passenger, Dr. Simone Clark, demonstrated remarkable grace and patience during an incident that should never have occurred, and I would like to invite her to reboard the aircraft now so that she can finally take the seat she was always entitled to occupy. The words fell into the gate area like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of recognition and embarrassment and belated understanding through passengers who were suddenly reassessing everything they'd witnessed earlier, realizing that the woman who'd been escorted away in apparent defeat had actually triggered the consequences that had just played out in front of them. Simone stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the terminal as she walked toward the gate desk. Her posture straight and her expression carefully neutral despite the complicated swirl of emotions churning beneath her composed surface, and Maria handed her a new boarding pass with a smile that contained more warmth and respect than any first-class ticket could ever purchase. Dr. Clark, welcome aboard, Maria said softly, her voice carrying undertones of admiration and gratitude. Your seat is ready for you. Simone walked down the jet bridge with Kendra beside her, the two women moving through the enclosed tunnel that connected terminal to aircraft, while behind them, passengers watched and whispered and pulled out phones to capture the moment when the woman who'd been wronged returned to claim what had always been hers. The aircraft door stood open, and Aaron waited there with an expression that was equal parts apologetic and relieved his earlier discomfort at witnessing injustice, now transformed into the opportunity to be part of making things right. Dr. Clark, I'm so sorry about what happened earlier, Aaron said, as she approached his words tumbling out with the urgency of someone who'd been carrying guilt for hours and finally had the chance to express it. I should have spoken up more strongly. I should have insisted that Captain Hayes was wrong. I should have done more than just stand there feeling uncomfortable while you were being treated so badly. Simone paused at the threshold of the aircraft, looking at this young man who'd shown a glimmer of moral courage in a situation where most people had chosen silence or active complicity. And she understood that his apology mattered not because it changed what had happened, but because it represented the possibility that good people could learn from witnessing injustice and choose differently next time. Aaron, you did speak up even though it was uncomfortable and risky to contradict your captain. That took courage, and I appreciate it more than you probably realize. The fact that you felt guilty about not doing more tells me you're exactly the kind of person this industry needs in positions of responsibility. She stepped into the first-class cabin and found herself facing Tyler Preston, who'd gone very still in seat 2B as he finally understood that the woman whose seat he'd taken was standing right in front of him, that the delay and drama and crew terminations had all resulted from his passive participation in an injustice he'd found mildly amusing at the time. Tyler's face had gone red with embarrassment, and he fumbled with his seatbelt with shaking hands. His earlier entitlement completely evaporated in the face of accountability that had finally caught up to his casual complicity. "I didn't know," Tyler stammered, gathering his things and standing awkwardly in the aisle. "The captain just told me this was my seat, and I didn't ask questions. I didn't think about why you'd been turned away. I just took what they were offering and didn't care about anything except my own comfort." Simone looked at him for a long moment. This young man who represented so many people who benefited from injustice without ever having to confront their role in perpetuating it. And she chose her words carefully because this was an opportunity to either shame someone into defensive backlash or potentially plant seeds of genuine understanding. "Tyler, the next time you're offered something that seems too convenient, something that comes at someone else's expense, I hope you'll remember this moment and ask yourself whether you want to be the kind of person who questions unfairness or the kind who just enjoys the benefits without caring how they were obtained." Tyler Preston made his way down the aisle to the middle seat in row 12 that had been hastily assigned to him when the gate agents had reshuffled seating assignments to accommodate Dr. Clark's return to her rightful place, and every passenger he passed seemed to look at him with a mixture of judgment and pity, recognizing him as the person who'd been sitting in the disputed seat and making their own assumptions about his character based on that association. He slumped into the uncomfortable middle seat between a businessman absorbed in his laptop and a woman reading a paperback who both shifted slightly away from him as if his proximity might contaminate them with whatever moral failure had led to his current circumstances. And Tyler realized with a sick feeling that this flight was going to be the longest few hours of his life. The woman with the paperback leaned over slightly, her voice pitched low but clearly audible in the quiet cabin. "You're the guy who took her seat, aren't you?" While the captain was throwing her off the plane for literally no reason except racism. "You just sat there enjoying your upgrade and didn't say a word." Tyler wanted to defend himself, wanted to explain that he hadn't understood what was happening, wanted to claim ignorance, as if that somehow absolved him of responsibility for benefiting from discrimination. But the words died in his throat, because he knew they would sound hollow and self-serving even to his own ears. Instead, he pulled out his phone and discovered that someone had already posted a video of the earlier confrontation on social media. The footage showing him clearly visible through the aircraft window, headphones on and smirking while Dr. Clark was being denied boarding. And the comments section was filled with people dissecting his privilege and his complicity with the kind of viral righteousness that could destroy reputations and end careers. "Oh, God," Tyler whispered, scrolling through hundreds of comments that tagged his name, that identified his employer, that called for consequences that extended far beyond an uncomfortable middle seat on a delayed flight. Someone had found his LinkedIn profile and his Twitter account and his Instagram feed, and people were going through years of his posts looking for additional evidence of problematic behavior, finding plenty of casual insensitivity and tone-deaf privilege to fuel their righteous anger. His phone began buzzing with text messages from friends and colleagues who'd seen the video asking if that was really him, asking what had happened, asking how he could have just sat there while someone was being treated that way. In seat 2, B. Simone settled into the space she'd paid for and been denied feeling the leather seat conform to her back and the extra legroom stretch out in front of her, and none of it felt like victory because the comfort of a first-class seat could never compensate for the exhaustion and humiliation and anger that had accumulated over the past few hours. Maria, promoted by the supervisor to handle the first-class service for this flight, given the sudden absence of the regular crew, approached with a handwritten note on Horizon Aviation Group stationery, her eyes shining with unshed tears as she handed it over. Dr. Clark, I just wanted you to know that what you did tonight, standing up and refusing to just accept the injustice, it meant more than you probably realize to those of us who see these things happen but don't have the power to stop them. Thank you for using your voice and your influence to make change, instead of just accepting a settlement and moving on. You made a difference. Simone read the note, which contained Maria's sincere gratitude and her personal email address, along with an offer to provide testimony for any official complaints or investigations, and felt something in her chest loosen slightly as she recognized that even in the midst of all the corporate maneuvering and power dynamics and consequences being meted out, there were individual human connections being formed, small moments of solidarity that mattered regardless of how everything else shook out. Maria, you're the one who made a difference by telling the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. That kind of integrity is rare and valuable, and I hope you'll continue to speak up when you see things that aren't right. Aaron approached next, his nervousness evident, but his determination clear, as he held out a piece of paper with phone numbers and email addresses carefully written in neat block letters. Dr. Clark. These are the contact details for 3 other flight attendants who've witnessed Captain Hayes making inappropriate comments or treating passengers differently based on their appearance. They were too afraid to formally complain because they thought it would end their careers, but after seeing what happened tonight, they want to participate in the investigation and make sure the truth comes out about his pattern of behavior. Simone accepted the paper, recognizing it for what it was, the beginning of the real accountability that went beyond individual terminations to address the cultural rot that had allowed Hayes to operate without consequences for years, despite multiple people knowing his conduct was wrong. Thank you, Aaron. Make sure they know that their participation in the investigation will be protected and that speaking up now takes tremendous courage. And please tell them that I meant what I said to you, that people like them are exactly what this industry needs in leadership positions. The replacement captain, a woman whose name tag identified her as Captain Patricia Williams, made an announcement from the cockpit, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd spent 30 years flying and had seen enough of aviation's evolution to understand the significance of what was happening tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize again for the delay this evening. I'm Captain Williams, and I'll be flying you to San Francisco tonight along with First Officer Rodriguez. I want you to know that Horizon Aviation takes the incident that occurred earlier very seriously, and the actions taken tonight represent our absolute commitment to ensuring every passenger is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who they are or what they look like. Now let's get you folks home. The aircraft pushed back from the gate 2 hours and 47 minutes late, the night air cool against the fuselage as the tug vehicle maneuvered them into position for taxi, and Simone watched through her window as JFK's lights spread out beneath them in the geometric patterns of runways and taxiways, the controlled chaos of an airport that never truly rested, no matter how late the hour grew or how many delays disrupted the carefully orchestrated dance of arrivals and departures. Captain Patricia Williams's voice came through the cabin speakers with updates on their taxi sequence and expected flight time, her professionalism evident in every word, and Simone found herself relaxing slightly as she recognized the competence and confidence that came from someone who'd earned their position through decades of hard work, rather than having it handed to them through connections or privilege. The takeoff was smooth despite the late hour and the aircraft's extended time sitting at the gate, the powerful engines accelerating them down the runway until that magical moment when the wheels left the ground and they were airborne, climbing steeply into the night sky, while New York fell away beneath them in a sprawl of light and shadow. Simone closed her eyes and let herself feel the exhaustion that had been building since the moment Captain Hayes had first blocked her path. Let herself acknowledge the emotional toll of fighting a battle she'd never asked for but couldn't walk away from once it had been thrust upon her. Her phone, still functional through the aircraft's Wi-Fi system, buzzed with a message from Kendra, who'd been communicating with the Horizon legal team throughout the boarding and departure process. The Memorandum of Understanding has been signed by Whitmore and countersigned by our attorneys. All terms are now legally binding with specified timelines and consequences for non-compliance. Independent Oversight Board formation begins Monday morning. You did it, Simone. You actually forced real change. But Simone didn't feel the satisfaction that Kendra's words implied she should feel, didn't experience the triumphant vindication that she'd imagined might come from successfully wielding her power to hold people accountable for their discrimination and force institutional reforms that might prevent future passengers from enduring what she'd endured tonight. Instead, she felt empty and tired and somehow diminished by the entire experience, as if fighting for basic dignity and respect had extracted a cost that couldn't be measured in contractual terms or policy changes, but lived somewhere deeper in her sense of who she was and what kind of person she'd become. The older woman across the aisle who'd witnessed the initial confrontation and stayed silent cleared her throat softly to get Simone's attention, and when Simone turned to look at her, she saw genuine remorse written across features that suggested a life lived mostly in comfort and privilege. Dr. Clark, I need to say something to you, even though I know it doesn't change anything about what happened. When that captain was treating you so badly earlier when he was making those terrible accusations and denying you the seat you'd paid for, I knew it was wrong. I saw what was happening, and I understood that it was discriminatory and unjust. But I didn't say anything, because I told myself it wasn't my business or my problem. She paused, gathering courage to continue, her hands twisting in her lap with the nervous energy of someone confessing a sin they'd been carrying for hours. I stayed silent because speaking up would have been uncomfortable for me, because I didn't want to make a scene or get involved in a conflict that didn't directly affect my life, and I've spent the past few hours thinking about all the times I've made that same choice, prioritizing my own comfort over standing up for what's right. I can't undo my silence tonight, but I wanted you to know that I'm ashamed of it, and I'm going to do better. Simone looked at this stranger who was offering an apology that couldn't change the past but might influence the future, and she recognized the courage it took to admit failure and commit to growth, rather than defensively justifying inaction or claiming ignorance as protection against guilt. Thank you for saying that. Silence in the face of injustice is its own kind of participation, but recognizing that and choosing differently next time is how we actually create change. The next person who needs someone to speak up might benefit from this moment you're having right now. A businessman several rows back, who'd been part of the crowd of frustrated passengers demanding explanations for the delay, stood up and walked forward to first class, stopping at Simone's seat with an expression that mixed embarrassment and admiration. Dr. Clark, I need to apologize as well. When this flight kept getting delayed, I was one of the people grumbling about difficult passengers causing problems, never thinking about the fact that you were the passenger involved and you'd done absolutely nothing wrong. I made assumptions based on what the crew was implying, and I should have known better than to automatically trust authority figures when they were clearly lying. These small acknowledgments and apologies kept coming throughout the first hour of the flight. Passengers who'd witnessed different pieces of the confrontation seeking Simone out to confess their own failures of courage or judgment or empathy. And while each individual apology was a tiny thing that couldn't erase the damage of their collective silence together, they represented something larger, a recognition that injustice required not just active perpetrators, but passive enablers who chose comfort over courage when moments of moral clarity demanded more. Maria made regular trips through the first-class cabin, checking on passengers with an attentiveness that went beyond standard service protocols, and when she stopped at Simone's seat, she leaned down slightly to speak in a voice meant only for the two of them. The supervisor told me that you gave Horizon an ultimatum about implementing real changes, or facing consequences that would ground their entire fleet. I don't know all the details, but I wanted you to know that those of us working the gates and dealing with passengers every day, we're grateful that someone finally forced the company to take discrimination seriously, instead of just handling complaints with vouchers and empty apologies. Simone accepted a bottle of water, the simple gesture of hospitality carrying more weight than it normally would because it represented service provided with genuine respect, rather than the grudging accommodation Hayes and Jessica had offered earlier. Maria, the changes only matter if people like you hold leadership accountable for actually implementing them, instead of just putting out press releases and hoping everyone moves on. Watch what they do over the next 6 months, document whether the promised reforms actually happen, and be willing to speak up if you see them backsliding into old patterns. Morning came to Captain Devin Hayes's household, with the sharp ring of a doorbell followed by the insistent knocking that suggested whoever was outside wouldn't be easily ignored or dismissed. And Hayes opened the door, still groggy from a restless night spent replaying the events of the previous evening, and trying to understand how a simple passenger removal had somehow ended with his termination and escort from the aircraft in front of witnesses who documented everything on their phones. The woman standing on his porch wore the neutral expression of someone delivering papers they'd been paid to deliver without caring about the emotional impact of their contents, and she handed him an envelope with his name printed on the label in official Horizon Aviation Group letterhead. Inside the envelope was his formal termination letter laying out in precise legal language the reasons for his dismissal, including violation of non-discrimination policies, making false statements in an official incident report, and creating a hostile environment for passengers through demonstrated pattern of biased conduct. The letter referenced the 2 prior complaints against him that he'd thought had been resolved and forgotten quotes from witness statements, including Maria's detailed account of the confrontation and Aaron's confirmation that Hayes had escalated a simple seating question into a security accusation without legitimate basis, and a notation that his termination would be reported to the FAA as a conduct issue requiring review of his pilot certification. Hayes felt his stomach drop as he read that final paragraph, because he'd spent 16 years building a career in aviation and maintaining a spotless safety record and earning the respect of his peers, and now all of that was being threatened, not because he'd made an error in judgment during flight operations, but because he'd treated a passenger with casual disdain based on prejudices he'd barely acknowledged to himself. The FAA review wouldn't necessarily result in losing his pilot's license, but it would be a permanent mark on his record that would make finding employment at any major airline essentially impossible, would force him to explain in every interview and application why his previous employer had terminated him for discrimination. Jessica Hayes received her own termination letter along with a detailed accounting of how her false statement about Dr. Clark's behavior at the gate had violated multiple company policies regarding honesty, integrity, and passenger treatment, and she sat at her kitchen table crying while her husband tried to make sense of what had happened and how his brother's casual racism had somehow triggered consequences that were destroying both their careers. How was I supposed to know she was some billionaire CEO with the power to get us both fired? Jessica sobbed, still not quite grasping that the wrongness of her actions existed, independent of the victim's identity or resources. Tyler Preston arrived at his office Monday morning to find a meeting request from HR waiting in his inbox. The subject line reading simply, "Discussion," regarding recent social media incident, and he spent the elevator ride to the 8th floor trying to prepare explanations and justifications that might salvage his reputation and his position at the tech company where he'd worked for 3 years. The HR director sat across from him with a tablet showing the viral video of the confrontation, the footage that had been viewed millions of times over the weekend and had tagged the company repeatedly through Tyler's LinkedIn profile and his bio that proudly announced where he worked. Tyler, we've received hundreds of messages from current and prospective clients expressing concern that our company employs someone who would sit comfortably in a stolen seat while a black woman was being humiliated and falsely accused of being a security threat. The HR director explained, her tone professional but firm. We've also had internal complaints from employees who are questioning whether they want to work alongside someone who demonstrated such a profound lack of basic empathy and moral courage. I'm not terminating you today, but I am putting you on notice that your behavior reflected poorly on our organization and our values, and any similar incident in the future will result in immediate dismissal. Tyler left the meeting feeling sick and ashamed, understanding for perhaps the first time in his privileged life that actions had consequences, and that benefiting from injustice made him complicit, regardless of his intentions or his ignorance. He spent his lunch break composing an apology that he posted to his social media accounts, acknowledging his failure to question what was happening and his willingness to accept benefits that came at someone else's expense, and while the responses were mostly negative and skeptical about his sincerity, a few people noted that at least he was taking responsibility rather than deflecting blame or claiming victimhood. The story broke in mainstream media outlets by Monday afternoon, with journalists picking up on the viral videos and digging into the details of what had happened and why Horizon Aviation Group had taken the unprecedented step of terminating a captain and flight attendant mid-service and implementing emergency policy reforms. Business reporters connected the dots to Dr. Simone Clark's identity and her company's critical relationship with Horizon. And while Simone declined most interview requests, she did release a brief statement through Pinnacle Biotech's communications team. What happened to me at JFK represents a pattern of discrimination that persists in the aviation industry and throughout corporate America, the statement read, Simone's words carefully chosen to shift focus from personal vindication to broader implications. I had the resources and the platform to demand accountability, but countless other passengers face similar treatment without any recourse or protection. The reforms Horizon has agreed to implement aren't about punishment. They're about creating structures that prevent discrimination and ensure everyone is treated with dignity regardless of their identity or appearance. My hope is that other companies will see this as an opportunity to examine their own cultures and make necessary changes before they face similar crises. 3 months after the incident at JFK, Horizon Aviation Group released its first quarterly report on the discrimination complaint review process, and the numbers were both validating and damning in equal measure. Of the 47 complaints that had been filed over the previous 5 years alleging discriminatory treatment by Horizon employees, the Independent Oversight Board had found legitimate cause for concern in 38 cases, with 8 resulting in terminations, 12 in suspensions and mandatory retraining, and the remainder in formal warnings and supervised improvement plans. The pattern that emerged from the investigation confirmed what Simone had suspected, that Horizon's previous HR practices had prioritized avoiding liability and protecting employees over actually addressing discrimination, with complaints routinely dismissed as misunderstandings or personality conflicts, rather than investigated as potential violations of civil rights and company values. Lawrence Whitmore, who'd survived the crisis but had been forced to accept significantly reduced authority with the board installing a new chief diversity officer, who reported directly to them rather than through his chain of command, gave interviews acknowledging the company's failures and outlining the comprehensive changes being implemented. We had created a culture where our frontline employees, particularly those in positions of authority like pilots and senior crew members, felt they could make discriminatory decisions without consequence as long as they framed those decisions in the language of safety or operational necessity. Whitmore admitted in a statement that was remarkably candid for a corporate executive discussing institutional failures. The mandatory bias training that Simone had required proved to be more than pro forma checkbox compliance with Horizon, partnering with leading researchers in unconscious bias and discrimination to develop programs specifically tailored to aviation contexts and the unique power dynamics that existed between crew members and passengers. Every employee from baggage handlers to senior executives participated in multi-day workshops that used real case studies, including the incident with Dr. Clark to illustrate how everyday decisions could either perpetuate or interrupt patterns of discrimination. Maria, the gate agent who'd spoken up during the initial confrontation, was promoted to a newly created position as regional passenger advocate, with authority to investigate complaints and recommend actions without going through the traditional HR channels that had buried so many previous concerns. She took the role seriously, implementing a system where passengers could report incidents immediately through a dedicated app rather than waiting weeks to file formal complaints through customer service channels that were designed to deflect and minimize rather than actually address problems. Aaron, the flight attendant who tried to intervene during the confrontation, was fast-tracked through a leadership development program and within 6 months had been promoted to trainer, responsible for teaching new crew members about de-escalation passenger rights and how to recognize and interrupt discriminatory conduct by colleagues. He used his own experience of staying silent despite knowing something was wrong as a teaching example, helping new employees understand that passive witnessing of injustice made them complicit even if they weren't the primary perpetrators. Simone established a foundation called First Class for All, funded initially with $10 million from her personal wealth and structured to provide legal support for passengers who experienced discrimination on airlines, in airports, or in any transportation context. The foundation maintained a network of volunteer attorneys who could respond quickly to incidents, offered guidance on documentation and complaint procedures, and tracked patterns of discrimination across the industry to identify companies and specific employees who warranted closer scrutiny. Within the first 3 months, the Foundation had taken on 47 cases, ranging from passengers being removed from flights for speaking languages other than English to disabled travelers being denied appropriate accommodations despite advance notice and documentation. The Foundation also funded research into discrimination patterns across the airline industry, collecting data that revealed how frequently passengers from minority backgrounds experienced differential treatment in everything from boarding processes to seat assignments to interactions with crew members. The research, published in partnership with academic institutions and civil rights organizations, provided empirical evidence that what Simone had experienced wasn't an isolated incident, but rather a predictable outcome of industry cultures that valued authority and efficiency over equity and passenger dignity. Simone sat in seat 2B on a different airline exactly 1 year after the incident at JFK, flying home to San Francisco after closing another major contract, this time with a consortium of Asian aerospace companies who'd sought out Pinnacle Biotech specifically because of Dr. Clark's reputation for integrity and the changes she'd forced throughout the aviation industry. The passenger next to her was a young black girl, perhaps 13 years old, traveling with her mother in the seats across the aisle, and Simone watched as the girl pressed her face against the window during takeoff, her expression filled with wonder and excitement that suggested this was a significant journey rather than routine business travel. The girl turned away from the window once they'd reached cruising altitude and noticed Simone watching her, offering a shy smile that transformed into curiosity when she recognized something familiar in Simone's face. "You're Dr. Clark, aren't you? The scientist who makes the medical equipment for space stations? We studied your work in my engineering club at school." Simone felt something warm bloom in her chest at this recognition that had nothing to do with the viral videos or the discrimination incident, but instead connected to her actual life's work, the technology and research that had driven her since long before that night at JFK had transformed her into an accidental civil rights icon. "I am. And what kind of projects is your engineering club working on?" The girl, whose name was Amara, launched into an enthusiastic explanation of their current challenge involving designing emergency oxygen systems for high-altitude aircraft. Her technical vocabulary, impressive for someone so young, and her passion for the subject evident in every gesture and expression. Her mother listened with obvious pride, interjecting occasionally with questions that suggested she'd been encouraging Amara's interests and supporting her education with the same dedication that Simone's own parents had shown when she'd been a curious child, taking apart radios and dreaming of building things nobody had imagined yet. The hardest part is figuring out how to make the system work in really cold temperatures, Amara explained, her hands moving through the air as she sketched invisible diagrams. Because at high altitude, everything freezes and most materials get brittle or stop functioning correctly, so we need to find solutions that can handle extreme conditions without adding too much weight or requiring too much power. Simone pulled out her tablet and opened her notes app, beginning to sketch some concepts that might help Amara think through the engineering challenges she'd described. And they spent the next 30 minutes collaborating on designs and discussing material properties and testing protocols, in a conversation that felt like mentorship and friendship and hope all woven together. When they finally paused, Simone pulled a business card from her bag and handed it to Amara, along with a personal note she wrote on the back. "This is my direct email address, which very few people have. When you're ready to think about college and internships, reach out to me." Pinnacle Biotech is always looking for brilliant young engineers who are passionate about solving hard problems, and I'd love to follow your progress. Amara's mother reached across the aisle to grip Simone's hand, her eyes bright with tears that she was trying to control, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of everything that moment represented for Black families who'd spent generations fighting to create opportunities for their children. "Thank you for being visible and for using your platform to make changes that matter." Amara has always loved science and engineering, but until the past year, she sometimes doubted whether there would be room for her in those fields, whether people would take her seriously or treat her fairly. Seeing what you did, how you refused to accept discrimination and forced real accountability, it gave her courage to believe that she could claim space in rooms that haven't always welcomed people who look like us. Simone felt the familiar sting of tears in her own eyes, understanding that this was why the exhausting battle of the past year had mattered, why she'd chosen to wield her power and influence in ways that were uncomfortable and disruptive, rather than accepting apologies and compensation and moving on with her life. Tell Amara that she doesn't just belong in those rooms, she's going to transform them. The future of aerospace engineering needs her vision and her brilliance, and anyone who tries to make her feel otherwise is wrong. The plane began its descent into San Francisco, the city spreading out beneath them in the golden light of late afternoon, and Simone looked out at the landscape that had been her home for 2 decades, the place where she'd built Pinnacle Biotech from nothing and established herself as a force within her industry. And she thought about all the changes that had rippled out from that night at JFK. The reforms at Horizon Aviation Group had spread to other airlines as industry leaders realized they couldn't afford to ignore discrimination patterns that might expose them to similar crises. The First Class for All Foundation had won legal victories that established important precedents for passenger rights and corporate accountability. Her own profile had risen in ways that gave her platform to advocate for changes that extended far beyond aviation into broader questions about equity and justice in corporate America. But more than any of those measurable outcomes, more than the policy changes and the legal victories and the press coverage, what mattered most was sitting next to her right now in the form of a 13-year-old girl who believed she could become an aerospace engineer because she'd seen a Black woman refuse to accept that she didn't belong in first class. That ripple of inspiration and possibility multiplied across thousands of young people who'd followed the story and internalized its lessons, represented the real transformation that Simone had fought for, even when she'd been sitting exhausted in the JFK terminal, wondering whether she had the right to wield her power the way she was planning to use it. The aircraft touched down smoothly, Captain Patricia Williams' voice coming through the speakers to welcome them to San Francisco and thank them for flying with the airline that had learned from Horizon's mistakes and proactively implemented similar reforms before being forced to do so through crisis. Simone gathered her belongings and prepared to deplane, and as she walked through the aircraft door into the jet bridge, she paused for just a moment to look back at the first-class cabin where she'd been sitting, the space that had become a battlefield and a victory, and ultimately just a place where people traveled while the real transformation happened in hearts and minds and systems that finally began to prioritize dignity over convenience. There was room for everyone now, and if that room had been won through conflict and consequences rather than being freely given, at least it was finally and truly there.